In the 12 years he had spent building his underground empire in Ironport, Donovan Crane had never known panic. Not when rivals aimed their guns at him on the darkened docks. Not when federal agents knocked on his door at midnight. But that afternoon, standing in the middle of Harborview Park and realizing his son had vanished from the sight of his 2 bodyguards, he felt the one thing the whole city believed he didn't possess: fear. Find him. Now. His voice dropped low, cold enough to drain the color from the towering bodyguard beside him. In Donovan's world, people had learned that the softer he spoke, the heavier the consequences. They fanned out in every direction. His leather-gloved hand clenched inside the pocket of his overcoat, each passing second like a blade pressed close. Toby was only 7. In a city where he had countless enemies willing to give up everything to reach his one weakness, a lost child was never a small matter. Then he saw him. Toby hadn't been taken. He wasn't crying. The boy was sitting on the stone steps at the far end of the park beside a woman Donovan had never seen before in his life. Donovan raised a hand to halt his bodyguards. He stood still, less than 10 steps away, and for the first time in a long while, the man who always controlled everything didn't know what to do. The woman was dressed plainly, a faded denim jacket, sneakers worn thin at the heels, auburn hair tied up hastily at the nape of her neck. In her hands was a hamburger wrapped in a crinkled sheet of foil. He watched her break it in 2, cradling it as though it were the most precious thing she owned, and hand half of it to Toby. "Take it, sweetheart," she said gently, her voice warm. "You look hungry." And what made Donovan's heart nearly stop wasn't a stranger feeding his son. It was Toby's face. In the 2 years since the boy's mother had gone, Donovan had hired the finest tutors, bought the most expensive toys, built a wall around his child that no enemy could ever breach. But not once had he seen his son look up at anyone the way he was looking at this woman, without wariness, without fear, but with wonder, like a child being truly seen for the very first time. The man all of Ironport feared stood rooted to the grass, silently watching a poor single mother share half a burger with his son, and she had no idea at all whose side she had just sat down beside. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story that moves you. The boy accepted the half of the burger with both hands, hesitated for a moment, then took a small bite. Rosa didn't stare at him. She had learned long ago that when someone was hurting, the last thing they needed was to feel examined. She simply sat there, looking out at the glittering lake in the distance, letting the silence become something gentle instead of awkward. Only after a long while did she speak softly, her voice so light it almost sounded as though she were talking to herself. "When I was your age, I used to sit alone on steps like this too." The boy stopped chewing and looked up at her with cautious eyes. "You did too?" he asked, his voice tiny. Rosa nodded and smiled. "Some days, all a person wants is to find a quiet place where no one makes them be cheerful or answer any questions. I'm guessing you were looking for a place like that." The boy said nothing, but his shoulders loosened a little. He didn't know that the woman sitting beside his son had only arrived in Ironport a little more than 3 months earlier. Rosa had moved to this city after everything back home collapsed, carrying her little daughter and 1 suitcase of old clothes. She worked 2 jobs at once, cleaning offices by day on the upper floors of buildings she could never afford to enter as a guest, then helping in the kitchen at a small diner near the bus station at night. Her life was contained in crowded bus rides, shoes worn thin at the heels, and a list of bills longer than her sleep each night. She didn't have time to watch the news. She didn't know anyone in this strange city. And the name Donovan Crane was as unfamiliar to her as any other name printed on the billboards along the road. That was why, when she saw the finely dressed boy sitting curled in on himself alone, she saw only a lonely child, not the son of the man all of Ironport was careful not to offend. "What's your name?" she asked. "Toby," he answered after a moment of hesitation. "My name is Rosa." She held out her hand, and the boy shook it with such solemn formality that she almost laughed. "Did you sneak out here?" Rosa asked, her voice holding no blame, only curiosity. Toby lowered his head and looked down at his polished leather shoes. "The men follow me all day," he whispered. "Everywhere I go, somebody follows. I just wanted to sit by myself for a little while." Rosa understood at once who the people he was talking about must be, though she imagined they were drivers or nannies employed by some wealthy family. She didn't ask anything more. Toby turned the remaining half of the burger in his hands. "You know," he said, his voice suddenly much lower, "at home I have a really big playroom, bigger than my friend's whole house. It has every kind of toy, Even a remote control airplane that can really fly. Rosa nodded and listened. But I never play with any of it, Toby continued, because playing alone is boring. My dad is busy. My dad is always busy. Some days I wake up and he's already gone. And by the time I fall asleep, he still hasn't come home. He lifted his eyes to Rosa, and they looked far older than his 7 years of life. I have the most toys in my class, but I'm the loneliest kid there. The words dropped between them like a pebble falling into still water, leaving circles that kept widening. Rosa felt something tighten inside her chest. She had known enough kinds of hardship in her life to understand that loneliness spared no one, not even children living in houses, where she was only allowed to clean the floors. She didn't rush to comfort him with empty words. Instead, she leaned toward him, her voice gentle but steady. You know, Toby, just because people are busy doesn't mean they don't love you. Sometimes grown-ups get trapped inside the things they think are important, until they forget that the most important thing is sitting right in front of them. I believe your father is like that too. Toby blinked, and for the first time since Rosa had sat down, the corner of his mouth lifted into a real smile. A few steps away, the man standing silently on the grass heard every word, and something inside him began to crack. Perhaps it was that smile on his son's face that finally pulled Donovan out of his paralysis. He stepped forward, each pace slow across the grass, and when his tall shadow fell over the steps, Rosa looked up. She didn't know who the man in the black overcoat was. She didn't sense the cold current his presence usually brought into any room he entered. She saw only a tall man with a hard, worn face and gray eyes fixed on the boy beside her with a kind of feeling she couldn't name. "Dad," Toby blurted, and in that single call, there was both joy and hesitation. Rosa understood at once. "Ah, so you're Toby's father," she said, smiling as she stood and brushed off the front of her dress. "He's a very good boy. We were just sharing an afternoon snack." Donovan opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. In 12 years, no one had ever spoken to him in such a calm, natural voice, as though he were merely a father coming home late from work and not the man half the city didn't dare look straight in the eye. Behind him, the bodyguard named Bridge stood frozen, unable to believe what he was hearing, because in all the years he had served his boss, he had never seen anyone face Donovan Crane without lowering their head. "Thank you," Donovan finally said, his voice rougher than usual. "Thank you for staying with the boy." Rosa waved it off, as though it were nothing worth mentioning. "It's all right. He looked so sad sitting here alone, and I was going to eat dinner anyway. It's nicer when there's someone to sit with." She bent down to look at Toby and lightly ruffled his hair. "Your father's here to take you home now. Next time, don't run off so far. You'll make everyone worry." Toby nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on Rosa, as if he didn't want to let her go. Donovan slipped a hand inside his coat and drew out a thick stack of money, crisp new bills lying flat against one another. He held it out toward her. "Take it. Consider it my thanks for the meal and for your time." Rosa looked at the money in his hand, then looked up at his face, and what she did next left both Bridge and Donovan stunned. She shook her head. "Put it away. I'm not taking it." Donovan frowned, as though he couldn't understand the answer. "This isn't about money," he said. "I only want to." "I know what you want," Rosa gently cut in, and there was no sharpness in her voice at all, only a quiet certainty. "But I shared half a burger with him because I wanted to, not because I expected to be paid for it. If I take your money now, then what I just did won't mean anything anymore." She gave a small shrug. "I really am poor, but I still have this." She placed her hand over her chest. "And I'm not selling it." In that moment, the man who was used to giving orders and watching the whole world bend its knee before his money suddenly felt the stack of bills in his hand grow heavy and absurdly useless. He slowly drew his hand back, tucked the money into his coat, and for the first time in his life, Donovan Crane felt as though he had just lost a game whose rules he hadn't even had time to understand. Bridge swallowed hard, his eyes shifting from the plainly dressed woman to his boss and then back again, as though he were witnessing something that didn't belong to the world he knew. In that world, everything had a price. Everyone could be bought one way or another. Loyalty as much as silence. And yet this woman had just pushed away Donovan's entire stack of money, with nothing more than one sentence and one hand placed over her heart. Rosa paid no attention to the shockwave she had just caused. She glanced at her cheap wristwatch, murmured that she was about to be late for her evening shift, then bent down to say goodbye to Toby. "Take care of yourself, young man," she said. "And remember, you're not as alone as you think you are." She slung her worn cloth bag over her shoulder, gave Donovan a nod, then turned and walked toward the bus stop, her small figure gradually disappearing into the flow of people, leaving behind a man standing in silence with thoughts he had never before been forced to face. That evening, about 10 kilometers from Harborview Park, on the top floor of an old warehouse sitting close to the water's edge, Donovan Crane returned to the world where he truly belonged. The vast room was lit by only a few dim yellow lamps, their glow washing over the grim faces of more than a dozen men standing along both walls. Donovan sat in the leather chair at the far end of the room, one leg crossed over the other, and the ease in his posture was more frightening than any outburst of rage could have been. In front of him stood a middle-aged man named Marcus Dell, his shoulders trembling, though there was no cold in the room. He had once been a man Donovan trusted enough to place in charge of several docks on the eastern side. But for the past 3 weeks, he had been quietly moving goods for someone else and pocketing the difference for himself. In Donovan's world, there were things that could be forgiven, but betrayal wasn't one of them. He didn't shout. He didn't even raise his voice. Donovan only turned the silver ring on his finger slowly, his cold gray eyes fixed on Marcus, as if he were reading every thought running through the man's head. "I took you in when no one else would hire you," he said, his voice so quiet that the entire room had to hold its breath to hear. "I paid you twice what you deserved. I let you stand in this room, a place many men would trade their lives just to enter." He paused, and that silence was heavier than 1,000 threats. "And yet you thought I wouldn't know, Marcus." The man collapsed to his knees, stammering pleas, saying he had been desperate and foolish, that he had a wife and children to care for. Donovan stood, walked toward him, and the whole room parted like water before the prow of a boat. He bent down until he was level with Marcus's eyes, and what he said next turned the man even paler than when he had thought he was about to lose his life. "I have a child too," he said, "and because of that, tonight you get to walk out of here on your own 2 feet. But if I ever see your face in Ironport again, or hear that your wife and children are going without because of you, there won't be a conversation next time." He gave a signal, and 2 men hauled Marcus up and dragged him outside. Not a single drop of blood was spilled, but everyone who witnessed it understood that they had just seen the reason this entire city lowered its voice whenever the name Donovan Crane was spoken. When the door closed, Bridge stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Boss, there's something else. Our people report that Silas Vance has started moving again around the southern harbor." The name tightened Donovan's jaw. Silas Vance wasn't an ordinary enemy. Many years earlier, the harbor Donovan now controlled had belonged to Silas's father, an old kingpin who had fallen in the power struggle Donovan had won. Silas had grown up with one belief carved deep into his bones, that everything Donovan possessed should have been his, and that this man had stolen not only territory, but also the inheritance, honor, and position he believed he had been born to claim. To Silas, this wasn't just business. It was a blood feud, an old wound that had festered year after year, and he had waited a long time for the day he could demand everything back. "He's returned," Bridge continued, "and this time he isn't hiding it. He's recruiting men, watching every move you make." Donovan walked to the great glass window and looked down at the glittering lights of Ironport stretching all the way to the horizon. This whole city lay beneath his gaze, and for 12 years, he had held it with a hand that never trembled. But tonight, standing at the heart of the empire he had built, his mind drifted back to a stone step in the park, to the sound of his son's laughter, to a woman who had pushed away an entire stack of his money with nothing more than a sentence. "Keep an eye on Vance," he said, his voice still cold, though there was a distant note in it that Bridge couldn't understand. "I want to know where he eats, where he sleeps, and who he meets." Bridge nodded and withdrew. Left alone, Donovan tightened his gloved hand, and for the first time in many years, he realized he had something to lose that mattered more than this empire. While Donovan stood in the heart of his empire, looking down over the entire city, Rosa was in another corner of Ironport, stepping off the last bus and walking nearly 1 more kilometer to reach her apartment. It was on the 3rd floor of an old building, where the stairwell always carried a faint smell of damp mold, and the light bulb in the hallway had been broken since the week before, though the landlord still hadn't bothered to replace it. The apartment was only one small room, just large enough for 1 bed, a wobbly dining table, and a tiny kitchen corner. But to Rosa, this was the whole world, because inside that cramped little world, The most precious thing in her life was sleeping soundly. Mrs. Alvarez, the neighbor who watched Maddie for her every evening in exchange for a small amount of money, gently pressed a finger to her lips when Rosa came in. "She was very good," the woman whispered. She finished all her rice before she agreed to go to sleep. Rosa thanked her again and again, pressed a few small bills into her hand, then saw her to the door. She tiptoed over to the bed, where her little daughter lay curled up, hugging a stuffed bear whose one ear had been worn almost bare. Maddie was only 5 years old, with tangled curls and dimples that made Rosa forget every trace of exhaustion whenever she looked at them. She bent down and kissed her daughter's forehead, and as if the child could feel the familiar warmth of her mother, Maddie stirred slightly and opened her eyes. "Mommy's home," Maddie murmured through her sleepiness. "Mommy's home now," Rosa whispered, brushing the loose strands of hair away from her forehead. "Go back to sleep." But the little girl was already more awake, sitting up, rubbing her eyes, and asking her mother to tell her a story. Rosa knew she was worn to the bone, her legs almost numb after 2 work shifts, but she never refused her daughter that one thing. She lay down beside her, pulled the blanket over them both, and began telling a story she made up herself about a princess who lived in a small castle but had a great big heart. Maddie giggled, and to Rosa, that laughter was worth more than all the money she had never had. That night, after the little girl had drifted back to sleep, Rosa lay staring up at the ceiling, stained with old watermarks, and let her mind wander somewhere far away. She thought about little Toby in the park, about the loneliness in his eyes, and for some reason her heart tightened so painfully. Perhaps it was because she understood that feeling better than almost anyone. Rosa had grown up in houses that were never really hers, passed from one foster family to another, always the child sitting at the edge of every meal, the child no one was truly waiting for at home. She had once sat on unfamiliar steps, hugging her knees as she watched other children being picked up by their parents, and taught herself to say that it was all right, that she was fine. Those years had taught her one lesson she had carried for the rest of her life: that loneliness was the hungriest thing in the world, hungrier even than an empty stomach, and that sometimes a stranger willing to sit down beside someone could save an entire soul. That was why she never walked past a hurting person without stopping, even when there were only a few coins left in her pocket. She had no idea that the half of a burger she had shared with a lonely child in the park that day had touched a world she couldn't possibly imagine, a world of power and darkness that felt tens of thousands of miles away from her tiny apartment. To Rosa, it had only been one ordinary kindness among many ordinary kindnesses she had done before, something that would soon fade into forgetfulness amid the daily worries of food, rent, and survival. She pulled the blanket over her daughter once more, closed her eyes, and slipped into a brief sleep before the alarm clock would ring again in the dim gray of early morning. Outside, the city of Ironport was still awake, and the gears of fate had already begun to turn, drawing her life and the life of the most powerful man in the city closer together in a way no one could have foreseen. Inside the vast mansion set behind tall iron gates and perfectly trimmed hedges, something strange was happening, something Donovan himself did not notice at first. That evening, for the first time in a very long while, Toby did not eat dinner in silence and then retreat to his playroom alone as he usually did. The boy lingered at the long dining table, swinging his legs that still did not reach the floor, and began to talk. "Dad, her name is Rosa," he said, his eyes lighting up in a way Donovan could not remember seeing for a long time. "She didn't ask me 1,000 questions like the tutors do. She just sat down beside me, and you know what, Dad? She broke her burger in half and gave part of it to me, even though I could tell she was hungry too. She said she shared it because she wanted to." Donovan set down his knife and fork and listened. He had grown so used to silent dinners that the sound of his son talking so eagerly left him unsure how to respond. All through the meal, the name Rosa came up again and again like a refrain. "She told me I'm not as alone as I think, Dad. She said grown-ups being busy doesn't mean they don't love you." Toby told him about the way she smiled, the way she ruffled his hair, the way she told him not to run so far next time because he would make everyone worry. The boy even remembered the color of her faded coat and the worn cloth bag she carried over her shoulder. Donovan sat listening, and inside him rose an emotion so tangled he could not name it. It had been 2 years since Toby's mother had died, and he had poured into this child everything money could buy. He had hired tutors who graduated from the most prestigious schools, brought a child psychologist to the house every week, and filled his son's playroom with every toy any child could ever dream of. And yet not one of those things had made Toby's eyes shine the way they did now, as he talked about a poor woman and half a burger shared on the steps of a park. When Donovan tucked his son into bed that night, Toby caught his sleeve before he could turn off the light. "Dad, can we go to the park again tomorrow?" he asked, his voice full of hope. "Maybe Miss Rosa will be there." Donovan went still. "We'll see, son," he answered, a reply he knew was an evasion the moment it left his mouth. But when he stepped out of his son's room and closed the door behind him, Toby's question followed him down the long, hollow hallway. Standing alone in his dark study, Donovan poured himself a glass of liquor but did not drink it. He thought about the woman in the park, about the way she had pushed away his stack of money, about the sentence she had spoken with one hand pressed over her heart when she told him she would not sell that part of herself. He had spent his whole life believing that everything in this world had a price, that power and money could buy obedience, loyalty, even affection. But this woman, in a single afternoon, had done what all his fortune had failed to do for 2 years. She had made his son smile. Donovan was not the kind of man who let things he did not understand simply pass him by. He picked up the phone and called Bridge. "There is a woman," he said, his voice low and clear. "Her name is Rosa. She was at Harborview Park this afternoon. I want to know who she is, where she lives, and what she does for a living." On the other end of the line, Bridge hesitated for a moment, because he understood too well that when his boss asked for someone to be investigated, that person was usually in serious trouble. But this time, there was something different in Donovan's voice. Not the coldness of a predator, but a curiosity, almost soft enough to sound like weakness. Something Bridge had never heard from him before. "I don't want anyone bothering her," Donovan added, as though he had read his subordinate's thoughts. "Just find out." He hung up, walked to the window, and for the first time in many years, the most powerful man in Ironport found himself curious about a person not because she was a threat, but because she held a secret he longed to understand. Within only 2 days, Bridge had placed a thin file on Donovan's desk. Rosalind Hartley, 27 years old, newly arrived in Ironport a little more than 3 months earlier, working 2 jobs at once, raising her little daughter alone in a rented apartment in a poor working-class neighborhood on the west side of the city. No suspicious debts, no shady connections, no ties to any power in the city. Just a woman struggling to live decently in a place where decent living did not come easily. Donovan read that file again and again, and the more he read, the more he felt something drawing him closer to this person. The following evening, instead of sitting in the old warehouse by the water's edge or in his dark study, Donovan Crane did something even Bridge had not expected. He told the driver to take him to a shabby little diner near the bus station, the place where the file said Rosa worked the evening shift. The diner was cramped, lit by dim yellow lights, the smell of grease and coffee mingling in the air. Donovan walked in, wearing his expensive black overcoat, and his presence made the whole diner pause for a moment. Though no one knew who he was, people could still feel a strange current coming from this man. He sat down at a table in the corner, and when Rosa stepped out from the kitchen with an apron tied around her waist, she stopped short as she recognized him. "Toby's father," she said, both surprised and wary. "Are you looking for me?" Donovan nodded. And for the first time in his life, the man who was used to controlling every conversation found himself awkwardly searching for words. "I didn't mean to bother you at work," he said, his voice somewhat stiff, "but I wanted to thank you in a more proper way than a stack of money." Rosa crossed her arms and stood a short distance from the table. "I already told you. I don't need to be thanked. I only did what anyone should do." "But not everyone does," Donovan replied, and the truth of that sentence was enough to make Rosa fall silent. He cleared his throat, turning the silver ring on his finger, a habit that revealed itself whenever he was not entirely in control of the situation. "My son has been talking about you for 2 days. I've never seen him like this." He paused, as though wrestling with words that did not belong to his world. "I would like to invite you and your daughter to a meal. A proper one. A decent one. Not to repay you, but because I think Toby would be happy to see you again. And perhaps I would be too." The last sentence came out so quietly it was almost a murmur, and the clumsiness of that powerful man carried something both strange and honest. Rosa looked at him for a long while, torn inside. She did not know this man. She knew nothing about him except that he was wealthy, and that there was something about him that made people keep their distance. The instincts of a cautious single mother told her to refuse, to keep away from a rich stranger who had suddenly appeared at her workplace. "I don't know you," she said plainly, "and I have to be careful. Because I have a daughter. Donovan nodded, without the slightest sign of offense. You're right, he answered. You know nothing about me. If I were you, I'd be careful too. That honesty surprised Rosa a little. She glanced through the small window, where people outside were still hurrying past, then thought of the lonely little boy whose eyes had brightened when someone listened to him. She was not doing this for the man in front of her, but for that child. One meal, she finally said, her voice still cautious but softer now. Somewhere public, during the day, and I'll bring Maddie with me. If it makes Toby happy, I'm willing. But I'm telling you now, I don't need anything from you except that. Donovan nodded, and something almost like relief passed across his hard-worn face. Agreed, he said. Thank you, Rosa. When he stood and walked out of the diner, Rosa watched his tall figure disappear beyond the door, unable to understand why a man like that had to struggle so hard just to offer one simple invitation. The meal took place at Saturday noon in a warm family restaurant with a shaded outdoor courtyard, a bright and crowded place exactly as Rosa had requested. She came with Maddie, and the little girl wore the prettiest dress she owned, though it was only an old dress Rosa had washed and pressed so carefully that it looked almost new. Toby was already seated at the table with his father, and the moment he saw Rosa, his face lit up. But what drew everyone's attention was the instant the two children saw each other. Maddie, with the fearless innocence of a 5-year-old child who had never learned to recognize barriers, ran straight over to Toby and announced that his shirt had a dinosaur on it that she liked, then immediately asked whether he knew what a Tyrannosaurus Rex ate. Toby, who was used to children at school keeping their distance because they knew who his father was stunned by this friendship that came with no hesitation at all. He stammered that a Tyrannosaurus Rex ate meat, and Maddie cried out in delight, pulled out a chair beside him, and began an endless stream of questions about dinosaurs, about outer space, and about why the sky was blue. There was something in Maddie's guileless innocence that touched a door inside Toby, one that all the expensive tutors and child psychologists had never been able to open. The little girl did not care whether Toby was rich or poor. She was not cautious because of his father's name. She did not look at him as though he were different. To Maddie, Toby was simply a new friend who knew about dinosaurs, and that was more than enough. Little by little, Toby's guarded shell began to peel away in pieces. He started talking about his remote control airplane, then invited Maddie to help him come up with a name for an imaginary dinosaur. The two children giggled, bent their heads close together, and scribbled all over the paper table mat. And then it happened. Toby burst out laughing. It was not the small smile at the corner of his mouth that Rosa had seen in the park, but a bright, clear, carefree peal of laughter. The laughter of a child who was truly allowed to be a child. Across the table, Donovan went still. He set down his glass of water, and for a moment, the man all of Ironport feared sat motionless, listening to his son's laughter as though it were the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It had been 2 years. 2 years since he had heard his son laugh like that. Rosa caught his gaze, and she read everything in it. The astonishment, the joy, and the dull ache of a father realizing what he had missed. She said nothing about it. She only smiled faintly and said in a gentle voice, "Children don't need much. They just need to be heard and to have someone beside them." Donovan turned to look at her. "How do you do that?" he asked, his voice low. "How do you know what to do with them?" Rosa shrugged, her eyes following the two children as they chattered happily. "I don't know what to do at all," she answered honestly. "I'm just present. I think people keep believing that loving a child means giving them so many things, but what they remember most are the moments when someone was truly there with them, not halfway there, not listening while looking at a phone, but really there." Her words were simple, but to Donovan, they were like a shaft of light falling into a dark room where he had lived for far too long. Throughout the meal, Donovan said little, but he watched. He watched the way Rosa bent down to wipe sauce from her daughter's chin, the way she listened to Maddie's stories with the kind of attention that made them seem like the most important thing in the world, the way she gently encouraged Toby whenever he grew shy. And he realized that this woman, who had nothing in her hands but love, was wealthy in a way his entire fortune could never match. When the meal ended, and the two children hugged each other and promised to meet again, Toby ran over and took Rosa's hand, looking up as he asked whether he could see her and Maddie again. Rosa bent down, smiled, and said of course. Watching that scene, Donovan felt a strange emotion beginning to take root in his chest, a warmth he had buried long ago, and he suddenly realized that he did not want this woman near him only for his son's sake. but for his own as well. That meal planted a seed inside Donovan that he could not ignore. In the days that followed, his men began to notice their boss changing in small but unmistakable ways. Some evenings, instead of staying in the warehouse by the water's edge to discuss business until late into the night, Donovan would stand up in the middle of a meeting, put on his overcoat, and say he had to go home. Bridge and the others exchanged baffled looks, because in all those years, nothing had ever been more important than work to Donovan Crane. But now he came home before the sky had fully gone dark, right at the hour Toby ate dinner, and for the first time in a very long while, father and son sat together at the long dining table that had once always held only the boy. His awkwardness in the role of an ordinary father was both almost funny and heartbreaking. One evening, after the housekeeper had gone home, Toby said he wanted a glass of warm milk before bed, the way his mother used to make it for him. Donovan stood in his vast, gleaming kitchen and looked around as though it were a foreign land. The hand that had made even the toughest men tremble, the hand used to giving orders and deciding other people's fates, now fumbled for the carton of milk, poured too much and then too little, and heated it until it nearly spilled over. He carried the not quite perfect glass of milk to his son, and Toby drank it with solemn care, as though it were the finest thing in the world, even though they both knew it was far from perfect. "Thank you, Dad," the boy said, and there was a happiness in his voice that made Donovan's heart ache. That night, Toby asked his father to read him a story. Donovan sat down on the edge of the bed, holding the picture book awkwardly in his hands, and began to read in the deep voice that was far more used to making threats than telling fairy tales. He stumbled through the words, pausing in places because he didn't know when to raise or lower his voice, but Toby didn't mind at all. The boy lay on his side, eyes fixed on his father's face, listening as though this were the most miraculous thing that had ever happened in that room. When the story ended, Donovan closed the book and was about to turn off the light when Toby caught his hand. "Dad," the boy asked, his voice small and hesitant in the darkness. "Was it because I was bad that you didn't stay home with me much before?" The question struck Donovan like a blow no enemy of his had ever managed to land. He sat there in silence, his throat tightening, and in that moment, the man who never showed emotion before anyone suddenly felt his eyes burn. "No, son," he finally managed to say, his voice rough and thick. "It was never because of you. It was because of me. I was wrong to think giving you so many things would be enough. I thought that if I worked hard enough, made enough money, and built a wall strong enough around you, you would be safe and happy. But I forgot that what you needed most was only for me to be here." He reached out and stroked his son's hair, the gesture clumsy but full of tenderness. "I'm sorry, Toby. I'll start over." The boy smiled in the darkness, wrapped his small arms around his father's neck, and Donovan held him tightly, feeling that small heart beating close against his chest. When he left his son's room that night and stood alone in the long hallway, he knew something in the steel wall he had built around his life had cracked open, and through that crack, for the first time in 2 years, a warm light was beginning to slip in, and he understood, though he didn't yet dare say it aloud, that all of this had begun with one woman and half a burger on the steps of a park. In the weeks that followed, Rosa and Donovan met a few more times, always because of the 2 children, always in bright, crowded places. Little by little, her caution began to ease. That quiet man never crossed a boundary, was always polite, always kept the proper distance, and she began to see in him a father awkwardly learning how to love his child. She didn't ask him what he did for a living, and he didn't tell her. In Rosa's struggling world, a wealthy man in elegant clothes could have been anyone, a businessman, a lawyer, an investor. She had no reason to suspect anything, until one afternoon, when everything changed in only a few short minutes. That day, Rosa finished her shift earlier than usual and stopped by a small grocery store downtown to buy a few things for Maddie. Mrs. Marlene, the owner of the diner where Rosa worked, happened to be walking with her. Marlene had lived in Ironport for nearly her whole life, a seasoned woman who knew every corner and every dangerous name in the city. As the two of them were walking along the sidewalk, a sleek black car glided up and stopped in front of a nearby building, and the man who stepped out was Donovan Crane. He did not see Rosa, but what she witnessed next left her frozen. The people on the sidewalk, the ones who had been standing around talking, the rough-looking men, all of them suddenly fell silent and moved aside as he passed. A large man hurriedly bowed his head to him, his voice trembling. A few others avoided his eyes, as though even looking directly into them might be enough to bring disaster. The whole street seemed to hold its breath as Donovan walked by, and the way people shrank before him was not respect. It was pure fear. Beside Rosa, Marlene gripped her arm tightly, her voice dropping low with tension. "Lord, have mercy. Don't look," she whispered, pulling Rosa back into the shadow of an awning. "You don't know who that is." Rosa shook her head, her heart pounding. "That's Donovan Crane," Marlene said, each word coming out as though the name itself were dangerous to speak. "In this city, nothing happens around the harbor without him knowing. People say he holds half of Ironport's underworld in his hands. Those who offend him disappear without a trace. Even the police don't dare touch him. Stay away from that man, as far away as you can." Every word from Marlene cut into Rosa like a blade. She stood there with her back against the cold wall, watching the tall man disappear into the building, and the whole world seemed to turn upside down beneath her feet. That man, the man who had sat with her in the restaurant, awkward and unsure of what to say to the two children. The man who had listened to her talk about love and presence with the hungry eyes of someone searching for something he had lost. The clumsy father who had asked her to show him how to make his son laugh. That man was the one the whole city feared. Rosa felt a chill run down her spine. She had allowed her daughter, her little Maddie, to sit at the same table, to play, to make friends with the son of a crime lord. She had led her child into the orbit of a world whose danger she could not even imagine. All the beautiful images she had begun building in her heart suddenly cracked apart, and in their place came the icy fear of a mother. She thought of Marlene's words, that those who offended him disappeared, and her heart clenched. All the way home that evening, Rosa's legs felt heavy, her mind spinning between two images she could not reconcile. A tender father learning how to love his child, and a kingpin whose name alone was enough to make an entire street lower its head. She didn't know which image to believe, and for the first time since the day she met him, Rosa was afraid. That night, Rosa could not sleep at all. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching Maddie sleep soundly with her arms wrapped around her worn old stuffed bear, while an icy fear kept tightening around her chest. She had lost too much in her life, had struggled too long to build her daughter a home that was poor but safe, and now the thought that she might have accidentally drawn her child into the orbit of a dangerous world left her unable to breathe. Marlene's words kept echoing again and again inside her head. Those who offended him disappeared without a trace. She imagined unseen enemies, dangers lurking around that man, and she wondered what would happen if Maddie happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. As a single mother, she had no one to lean on, no safety net except herself. She could not take that risk. She would not take that risk, but even as that decision took shape, something else inside her rose up in protest. She thought of the man she had truly met, not the frightening shadow on the street, but the father sitting awkwardly at the table, the man who had asked her how to make his son laugh, the man who had listened to her speak about love with the eyes of someone starving to be saved. She had seen the way he looked at Toby, and that kind of love could not be faked. Could a father who loved his child that deeply be a completely cruel man? Her heart told her that he was far more complicated than the name the whole city whispered in fear. But then reason pushed the thought aside, because she had no right to gamble her daughter's safety on a feeling. She was not living for herself alone. She had Maddie, and a mother had to put her child above everything, even above the things her heart quietly longed for. The next morning, when her phone rang and the screen showed a number she had come to recognize, Rosa let it ring until it went silent. The second time it rang, she still did not answer. When a message appeared, Donovan asking whether the children could meet that weekend because Toby was looking forward to it so much. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers trembling, then finally typed back a few short lines, saying she was sorry, but she had been too busy lately, and perhaps they should not see each other anymore. She sent it before she could change her mind, then buried her face in both hands. This was the third time she had refused that man, but this time was entirely different from the two before it. The first time, she had refused his stack of money because of her self-respect. The second time, she had been cautious because he was a stranger. But this time, she was turning away not because of pride or wariness, but because of real fear. The fear of a mother who wanted to protect her only child at any cost. But what hurt her most was not that man, it was the boy. A few days later, when Rosa was walking past Harborview Park with Maddie on their way home, the little girl suddenly tugged at her hand and pointed toward the familiar stone steps. "Mommy, there's Toby," Maddie cried. Rosa looked up, and her heart seemed to clench. Toby was sitting there with his nanny, his small shoulders drawn inward in the same lonely posture she had seen the first time she met him. When the boy's eyes met Rosa's, his face brightened for a brief moment with hope, then fell again when he saw that she was not coming closer. He did not understand why the woman he cared about had suddenly disappeared, why their happy meetings had abruptly stopped. Rosa tightened her grip on Maddie's hand, turned away quickly before the little girl could run toward him, and walked on with tears blurring her eyes. She told herself she was doing the right thing, that she was protecting her daughter. But why did the right thing make her heart break so badly? And why did the image of that boy's disappointed eyes keep haunting her, refusing to leave her in peace? Donovan was not the kind of man who easily accepted a closed door without understanding the reason behind it. When his messages were met only with silence, and when Toby grew quieter by the day, he decided to find the answer himself. One evening, he went to Rosa's apartment, bringing no bodyguards, no luxury car, only himself standing before the old door on the 3rd floor. When Rosa opened the door and saw him, she took one step back, and he immediately read the fear in her eyes. "You know now," he said softly, not as a question, but as a fact. Rosa tightened her hand around the doorknob. "I know who you are now, Donovan. People told me about you, and I have a child to protect." He did not blame her. He only stood there, and for the first time since she had met him, that man who had always seemed so steady looked like someone worn down to the bone. "I didn't come to force you to do anything," he said. "I only want you to hear me once. After that, if you still want me to leave, I'll leave, and I'll never bother you again." There was something in his voice that made Rosa unable to close the door. She stepped out into the hallway, kept some distance between them, and let him speak. Donovan was silent for a long while, his gaze distant, as though he were looking toward some place far back in the past. Then he began to tell her, in the low, rough voice of a man who had never spoken these things aloud to anyone. He told her about his wife, Eleanor, the only woman who had ever made him believe he could become a better man. She had loved him even when she knew exactly who he was, had believed that one day he would leave that world behind and live an ordinary life. They had Toby, and for a few brief years, Donovan had tasted a happiness he had thought would never belong to him. But the world he had stepped into never let anyone go. 2 years earlier, an old enemy who wanted revenge on him had struck, and instead of aiming at him, they aimed at the most precious thing he had. Eleanor died on an evening that should have been entirely ordinary, simply because she was Donovan Crane's wife. His voice caught when he reached that part, and he gave no further details, because even remembering it was enough to break him apart. "She died because of me," he said. And for the first time, Rosa saw tears shining in those cold gray eyes. "Because of the life I chose. I swore on her grave that I would never let that happen to Toby. And do you know what I did? I locked him away. I built walls around him, hired people to guard every step he took, turned the whole house into a fortress. I thought I was protecting my son, but in truth, I turned his childhood into a prison without love. I was so afraid that I forgot a child needs to live, not only to be safe." He turned to look at Rosa, his eyes full of pain. "Until the day he slipped away to the park and met you. For the first time in 2 years, I saw my child smile. You did what all my money and power couldn't do. You reminded me that my son is still a child, and that he can still be happy." Rosa stood there listening in silence, and all the fear inside her slowly gave way to something else, a deep, aching understanding. She looked at the man before her, and no longer saw the terrifying kingpin the whole city whispered about, but a father broken by guilt and loss, a man who had loved in the only twisted way his pain had allowed him to love. "I'm not telling you this to ask for pity," Donovan said, quickly wiping the corner of his eye and regaining his familiar composure. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know the truth, and because you have the right to decide. I understand if you want to stay away. A good mother has to do that." He stepped back, ready to turn away. "But I want you to know that whatever you choose, you saved my son, and I'll be grateful to you for the rest of my life." Then he walked down the stairs, leaving Rosa standing there with a heart more fiercely torn than it had ever been before. While Donovan struggled with the changes stirring inside him, on the other side of the city, in a dark room thick with the smell of cigarette smoke, another pair of eyes had been quietly watching him for weeks. Silas Vance sat behind a wooden table covered with secretly taken photographs, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm against the tabletop, a faint, calculating smile resting on his lips. For weeks, Silas's men had followed Donovan Crane's every move, patiently recording every habit, every schedule, every connection of the enemy he hated more than anyone in the world. Silas had waited too long for this moment. Long enough to know that a hasty strike would lead nowhere. He needed a weakness, a crack in Donovan's seemingly impenetrable armor, and those weeks of relentless watching had finally given him what he was looking for. For years, Donovan Crane had been an untouchable fortress. He had no habits to exploit, no family beyond the son who was tightly guarded inside a mansion sealed behind high walls and iron gates, a child even Silas did not dare touch, because laying a hand on a child meant crossing a line that, even in the underworld, could turn a man into everyone's target. But recently, something had changed. The photographs spread across Silas's desk showed a different Donovan, a Donovan leaving the warehouse while the sky was still bright, a Donovan sitting in an ordinary family restaurant, and most importantly, a Donovan visiting more than once a poor working-class neighborhood on the west side of the city, a place where a man as powerful as he was had no reason to set foot. Silas had ordered his men to dig deeper, and the name Rosalind Hartley, along with her little daughter, slowly emerged from the distant photographs. "A poor woman," Silas murmured, turning through the pictures of Rosa walking down the street with Maddie's hand in hers. How unexpected. He almost laughed at the bitter irony of fate. The man who had taken everything from him, who had crushed his father's empire and stolen all that should have belonged to him, had finally exposed his fatal weakness through an ordinary woman and his own foolish compassion. To Silas, this was no longer simply a fight over territory. This was a chance to collect the blood debt that had burned inside him for so many years, to make Donovan taste the very loss Silas had endured when he watched his father fall and his inheritance vanish like smoke. He wanted Donovan to understand what it felt like to stand helpless while something precious was ripped from his hands, and there was nothing he could do. "Find out more about this woman," Silas ordered the subordinate standing beside him, his voice cold and flat. "Where she works, how she moves around, what time she gets off. I want to know everything." The subordinate nodded and wrote it down. "But what about the little girl?" he asked. Silas waved a hand, a flicker of calculation crossing his eyes. "I'm not touching the children," he said. Not out of kindness, but because even he understood the price of crossing that line. "I only need the woman. Just touching her will be enough to make Crane lose his mind. A lion that loses its coldness is nothing more than a wounded beast. And a wounded beast is far easier to kill." He stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the city glittering with lights, the very city Donovan held in his hands, the city Silas believed should have been his. The storm was drawing close, and this time he would not miss his chance. In the darkness of the room, Silas Vance's smile was as cold as a blade, and somewhere else in the city, Rosa had no idea that her kindness had unknowingly placed her in the sights of one of the most dangerous men alive. That evening was a Friday evening, and Mrs. Marlene's diner was busier than usual. Before starting her shift, Rosa had taken Maddie to Mrs. Alvarez's place as she always did, reminding the little girl to be good and promising she would come home early to finish the unfinished story about the princess. The child wrapped her arms tightly around her mother's neck, then happily ran into the neighbor's warm apartment, where she would be safe and far away from everything that was about to happen. Toby, too, was at home that same evening with his nanny inside the mansion sealed behind high gates, completely unaware of what was slowly closing in around the woman he cared for. Both children were somewhere safe, far from the darkness creeping closer, and that was the only thing that later, when everything had passed, both Rosa and Donovan would silently thank fate for. When the diner closed and the last customers had left, Rosa untied her apron, said goodbye to Marlene, then stepped out into the parking lot behind the diner to catch the last bus. The lot was deserted, with only the yellowish streetlights shining down on puddles left behind after the afternoon rain. She had taken only a few steps when she realized something was wrong. 2 black cars silently blocked the exit, and from the darkness, several tall figures stepped out, surrounding her in a way that made her heart pound hard. Rosa stopped, clutching her cloth bag tightly to her chest, instinct telling her these were not people who happened to be passing by. "Who are you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice from trembling. The tallest man stepped forward, wearing a black leather jacket, his face cold beneath the light. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice flat and threatening. "Our boss wants to speak with you. It'll be easier for everyone if you come with us quietly." Rosa took one step back, her eyes darting quickly for a way out, but she was already surrounded. Her heart was screaming with fear, but inside that fear, one single thought kept her standing. She could not collapse. because at Mrs. Alvarez's apartment, Maddie was waiting for her to come home. "I don't know who you people are, and I don't know who your boss is," she said, her voice steadier now, though her hands were still shaking. "I'm just an ordinary waitress. You've got the wrong person." The man gave a cold little laugh, a smile with no warmth in it. "We don't have the wrong person, Miss Hartley. Rosalind Hartley, with a little daughter named Maddie. As you can see, we know quite a lot about you." When Rosa heard her daughter's name come from a stranger's mouth, the blood in her body seemed to freeze. This was no longer only about her. "Don't you mention my daughter," she said, her voice suddenly hard as iron, her eyes burning with the courage of a mother ready to face the whole world to protect her child. "What do you want from me?" The man moved closer, and Rosa could feel the danger coming off these people. "We don't want anything from you," he said. "You're only a pawn. There's a man who cares a great deal about whether you stay safe, and our boss wants to use that. You come with us, and Donovan Crane will come looking." Rosa understood at once. Everything she had feared for so long was now crashing down around her, not because of anything she had done wrong, but because her kindness had accidentally drawn her into a war between men she had never even known. She thought about running, thought about screaming, but she knew she had no chance. She tried to buy time, slowly backing toward the light, still talking to distract them while her hand quietly slipped into her bag to find her phone. But the man noticed. He stepped forward and blocked her hand, snatched the bag away, and in that chaotic instant, Rosa knew she had fallen into a trap that only one person in the world could undo. She had only enough time to pray silently that no matter what happened, her Maddie would stay safe, before she was forced into one of the black cars and disappeared into the night of Ironport. The news reached Donovan less than an hour later. Mrs. Marlene, worried when Rosa did not board her usual bus and then found her cloth bag left behind on the pavement of the parking lot, had frantically tried to get word out, and through the tangled connections of the underworld, the rumor that Silas Vance's men had just made their move quickly reached Donovan. When Bridge reported it to him, the man sitting in his study suddenly rose to his feet, and what appeared on his face sent a chill down even Bridge's spine. Though he had followed him for more than 10 years, it was not a loud explosion of anger. It was a deadly stillness, the stillness of a storm in the instant before it tears apart everything in its path. Silas had crossed the one line even Donovan's enemies knew they were not allowed to touch. He had laid hands on an innocent person, a woman who had nothing to do with their world, only to draw Donovan into a trap. "Find where he's keeping her," Donovan said, his voice so quiet it was terrifying. "Right now." Donovan's network moved faster than any force in the city. In less than 2 hours, his men had traced the place where Silas was holding Rosa, an abandoned warehouse in the southern harbor, the very area Silas still dreamed of taking back. Donovan did not hesitate for even a second. He put on his black overcoat, and when he stepped out of the car in front of that warehouse with his most loyal men beside him, he was no longer the clumsy father heating milk for his son, or the man awkwardly searching for the words to invite someone to a meal. He was Donovan Crane, the man who had built an entire empire with a will of steel, and tonight all that power was focused on one single purpose. The warehouse door burst open, and what happened afterward proved exactly why all of Ironport feared his name. Silas's men, though numerous and fully armed, quickly realized they had misjudged the man they had provoked. Donovan and his men surged in with the decisiveness and precision of people who did not know hesitation, and one by one, Silas's henchmen were subdued, disarmed, and slammed to the ground before they even understood what was happening. In the middle of the warehouse, Rosa was tied to a chair, and when the door flew open, her eyes found Donovan through the chaos. In that moment, every fear she had carried about who he was disappeared, because what she saw was not a monster, but someone rushing in to save her. Silas Vance, realizing the game had turned against him, retreated into the corner of the room, his earlier arrogance now giving way to panic. Donovan walked toward him, each step slow, and the whole warehouse seemed to hold its breath. "You know the rules," Donovan said, his voice low and cold as ice. "In this filthy world of ours, there are lines no one is allowed to cross. You can come after me. You can fight over territory, money, power, and I'll accept those rules. But you touched an innocent woman to get what you wanted." He stopped directly in front of Silas, and his gray eyes flashed with something that made the man step back. "That is something I'll never forgive." The confrontation between the two men was brief and final. Silas, despite all the grand dreams he had nurtured, was no match for a man like Donovan once he had made up his mind. In only moments, he was completely overpowered. stripped of everything he had relied on, his men, his weapons, and even the arrogance that had fed him for so many years. Donovan did not end him, because he knew there were punishments heavier than death, and one of them was having to live in complete defeat while understanding that he had lost forever. "Take him away," he ordered, and his men dragged Silas outside. Then he turned back, and in the blink of an eye, the terrifying man from a moment before disappeared completely. He knelt beside Rosa, the hands so used to giving orders now trembling as he untied her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice breaking with worry. "Are you hurt anywhere?" Rosa, newly freed from the nightmare, looked into those eyes and began to cry. Not because she was afraid anymore, but because for the first time, she truly understood who the man kneeling before her was. Donovan brought Rosa back to his mansion that very night, not to show off, but because it was the safest place he could think of, a place where she could rest and steady herself after the nightmare she had just endured. On the way, he had sent someone to pick Maddie up from Mrs. Alvarez's apartment, and when mother and daughter were reunited, Rosa held her little girl so tightly it was as if she never wanted to let go, tears streaming down her face as she felt the familiar warmth of her child. Maddie, innocent and completely unaware of the danger that had just brushed past them, only chattered on about how Mrs. Alvarez had given her cookies and let her watch cartoons, then asked whether Mommy was all right because her eyes were so red. Rosa laughed through her tears, buried her face in her daughter's curls, and whispered that Mommy was all right. Mommy was just happy to see her. When they stepped into the vast mansion, Toby was waiting in the foyer, his little face drawn tight with worry in a way no child should ever have to carry. He had overheard bits and pieces from the people in the house that something bad had happened to Miss Rosa, and for hours he had not been able to sit still. But the moment the door opened, and he saw Rosa walk in, safe and unharmed, his whole face broke open. The boy rushed forward, crossing the great foyer, and threw his arms around Rosa, his small hands clutching her waist as if he were afraid she might disappear again. And then, from his trembling lips came a word that seemed to stop the entire room. "Mom," Toby cried out, his voice breaking through his sobs. "I was so scared I'd lose you." That name, spoken by a child who had not called anyone by that sacred word in 2 years, fell into the room and left everyone silent. Rosa sank to her knees and wrapped her arms around the boy, her tears falling beyond her control. She did not correct him. She did not tell him she wasn't his mother, because in that moment, she understood that love did not need blood to become real. She held Toby tightly, one hand still holding Maddie's, and whispered into his ear that she was here now. She wasn't going anywhere. A few steps away, Donovan witnessed it all, and the man who only hours earlier had made an entire warehouse tremble now stood there with his eyes blurred. He had seen many things in his life. He had seen power and betrayal, death and cruelty, but he had never seen anything that melted his heart the way the scene before him did. His son, the boy he had believed had closed his heart forever, now holding on to a woman and calling her mom. Donovan stepped forward and knelt at his son's level, one hand resting on Toby's shoulder, the other gently touching Rosa's. "Toby," he said, his voice rough and full of emotion. "Do you know something? I've made so many mistakes. I thought I could protect you by keeping you away from the whole world. But I was wrong. What you needed wasn't walls. It was love. And I promise you, from now on, I'll never let you be lonely again." Then he turned to Rosa, and in his eyes were all the things he had never dared say to anyone. "Thank you," he said softly. "You saved my son. You saved me too." He paused, struggling with words that felt foreign to a man like him. "I don't know what the future will be. I don't know whether someone like you could ever forgive someone like me. But I do know one thing. From the day you shared half a burger with my son on the steps of that park, you lit something in this house that I thought had gone out forever. 4 people, 3 wounded hearts, and 1 innocent little soul, gathered close together in the middle of that vast foyer, and for the first time in a very long while, none of them felt alone anymore. The upheaval of that night forced Donovan to face a truth he had avoided for 2 years. As long as he remained in the underworld, the people he loved would always be targets. Eleanor had died because of that, and the night before, Rosa had nearly suffered the same fate. He could no longer keep living under the illusion that power could protect the people he held dear, because that very power was what had placed them in danger from the beginning. But choosing to leave that world was not nearly as simple as outsiders might imagine. Donovan understood the price of it better than anyone. For many nights, he sat alone in his study, wrestling with a choice that tore him apart. The power he had held for 12 years was not only money and fear, it was also a shield. Once he let go of it, he would become vulnerable to countless old enemies still watching from the shadows, men who were only waiting for him to weaken before they struck. Leaving the throne meant losing his loyal army, losing the network of eyes and ears spread throughout the city, losing the authority that had once made all of Ironport bow its head. He would have to protect his family without those weapons in his hands. One night, when Rosa came by so Toby and Maddie could play together, she found him standing silently by the window, weighed down by heavy thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. Donovan was quiet for a long while before he turned back. "I'm thinking of doing something," he said, "and I'm not sure I have the courage for it. I want to leave all of this behind. The world that killed Eleanor, the world that almost took you from me. But if I let go, I won't be the man who can protect the three of you the way I could before. There will be people who come for me. I'll have to start over from nothing, like an ordinary man, weak and unprotected." He looked at her, his eyes torn. "I'm afraid that giving up power to be free may be the very thing that leaves me unable to protect the people I love." Rosa stepped closer, and for the first time, she reached for his hand of her own accord, the hand that had once made an entire city afraid, now trembling inside hers. "Donovan," she said gently but firmly, "a wall can keep enemies out, but it can also imprison the people inside. You've already seen that with Toby. Real safety doesn't come from spreading fear. It comes from people who are willing to stand beside you because they love you, not because they're afraid of you." Her words loosened something knotted deep inside Donovan. He realized that for all those years, he had mistaken control for safety and fear for loyalty, and he decided to choose a harder road, but a truer one. In the weeks that followed, Donovan began dismantling the empire he had built, piece by piece, carefully and wisely. He did not naively step into the light while leaving his family defenseless. Instead, he used his own sharp mind and his network to make a calculated withdrawal, handing certain operations over to others, cutting off dangerous ties, and turning the enormous fortune he had accumulated into things that were legal and lasting. He used his resources not to spread fear anymore, but to build, to protect the vulnerable, to create work for the very people in the poor working-class neighborhood where Rosa had once struggled to survive. That road was far from smooth, and there were still nights when he had to remain watchful against the shadows of the past. But each time he saw Toby laughing and playing with Maddie, each time he caught the trust in Rosa's eyes, he knew the price was worth paying. And Rosa, the woman who had once turned away because of fear, now understood that a person should not be judged only by the shadow their past cast over them, but by the choices they dared to make in order to become better. And she chose to believe in that man. 6 months passed, and on a late autumn afternoon, when golden sunlight lay softly across the treetops of Harborview Park, people could see a scene that only half a year earlier no one would have dared imagine. On the very stone steps where everything had begun, 2 families sat gathered together beneath the cool shade of the trees. Rosa spread a napkin over the steps and laid out sandwiches she had made with her own hands, and this time it was not about dividing one burger in half out of hardship, but about a warm, abundant meal enough for everyone. Toby and Maddie chased each other across the grass, their clear laughter ringing brightly through the open air, mingling with birdsong and the rustling of leaves. The boy who had once sat curled up alone with lonely eyes had now become a lively child, his gaze sparkling with joy, and beside him there was always a little friend who never left him behind. Donovan sat beside Rosa, no longer wearing the cold black overcoat of a kingpin, but carrying the quiet ease of a man who had finally found peace. His life was no longer measured by the fear he inspired or the empire he controlled, but by the simple things he had once considered ordinary: an outdoor meal, the laughter of children, a warm hand resting in his. He watched the 2 children playing, then turned to look at the woman who had changed his whole life, and deep gratitude rose inside him. He had once believed that true power meant making others submit, but now he understood that the greatest power in the world was having someone choose to stay beside him, not out of fear, but out of love. Rosa rested her head against his shoulder, quietly watching their 2 children, and she knew that no matter what road lay ahead, they would walk it together. Their story is a gentle reminder that a person's worth is never measured by the money in their pocket or the position they hold, but by the kindness they are willing to give even when they have so little themselves. A poor mother with nothing but a warm heart did what an enormous fortune could not do. She warmed a soul that seemed to have hardened and frozen under the weight of loss. Kindness, when offered without expecting anything in return, carries a miraculous strength. It can slip through the strongest walls, touch the coldest hearts, and rekindle light in places where darkness seemed destined to reign forever. Sometimes what a person needs most is not wealth or power, but simply someone willing to sit beside them, listen, and show them they are not alone. And sometimes, the smallest things, the things that seem almost meaningless, can change an entire life. If this story has touched your heart, please hit like and share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so that each day you can listen to more meaningful and captivating stories. How do you feel about Rosa and Donovan's story? What part of their journey moved you the most? Please leave a comment and share the feelings that come from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your voice. Thank you for spending your time with us until the very last moment. May you and your loved ones always be blessed with abundant health, overflowing joy, and peace in every day of life. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.